This is Dr. Sajid. On behalf of SDPI and UNESCAP, I welcome you all to the session Government of Tomorrow, Reimagining the Role of Government After COVID-19. Before I hand over the mic to our today's moderator, let me quickly run down through some housekeeping. We would like to request our speakers to keep their microphones off when they are not speaking to ensure good audio quality for everyone. Speakers are also encouraged to switch on their cameras, especially when they are speaking, if their network allows to do without any disruptions. The seminar will be recorded and the video will be posted online. You are welcome to revisit the discussion later and feel free to share it with your networks. We also invite questions from our audience and colleagues at the end or as the session goes. Please feel free to write them in the chat box or in the question and answer box on the right side. Please have the chat box open in the window as well, or you can also indicate that you want to speak by clicking the raise hand tab on the right side of the chat window. The session will also be telecasted live on SDTV's Facebook page. For those watching us on Facebook Live, please write your questions in the chat there. These questions will be conveyed to the speakers through our team. Today's session is moderated by Dr. Hamza Ali Malik. Dr. Hamza is Director Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division at UNESCAP. Prior to joining United Nations, Dr. Malik was Director Monetary Policy at the State Bank of Pakistan. Over to you, Dr. Hamza. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sajid. Thank you very much, SDPI colleagues, Abid and Sajid and many other colleagues for this opportunity to collaborate in hosting this session on the government of tomorrow. So this is a kind of an issue and topic that we continue to debate and talk about even in our own work here at UNESCAP. So very warm welcome to all participants, friends, colleagues, panelists. A warm welcome from Bangkok. I'm sure you're joining. Some of them are from Pakistan, from India, we have from Sri Lanka, a lot of South Asian colleagues. So warm welcome to all of them and all the participants to this session. This is the SDPI's 23rd Sustainable Development Conference, I gather. And the first one will conduct it in a virtual mode. And as I said, this session is on Government of Tomorrow, reimagining the role of government after COVID-19. Now, before I go to the panelists, I was thinking about how to do a little bit of context setting. If you think about it, we have almost now about 9-10 months behind us to learn what has gone past. In many ways, we are still in the midst of the pandemic induced crisis, but there are some lessons that are emerging. So in the context of today's conversation, one thing I want to highlight is, I think, and I would like to believe that the debate between the role of the state in running the affairs of the country or the economy more specifically is sort of settled or getting settled. There's much more clarity now that the government should play a much more proactive role, because as the pandemic ensued and it caused severe socioeconomic crisis, almost all countries across the globe intervened substantially in the economy through very, very expansionary fiscal packages and other monetary and financial measures to support businesses, support people, to try and stop the very massive decline in economic activity and so on and so forth, right? In a wide range of issues. It became very, very clear that at the end of the day, without a very supportive role of the government, economies and societies can't really function. This is worth highlighting because this became a bit of a norm over the last several decades, that the focus has been primarily in terms of running the economy has been in the business sector or the private sector. The government is supposed to take a step back, a sort of passive role, and the term we normally use is create an enabling environment for the business and private sector to flourish, but not actively try and give direction or engineer or give shape to how the economy should go. That debate is sort of settling down. It has very profound implications, I would say, on the policy objectives. Just to share one simple example, I think there's much more consensus, if I may use the word, and we'll learn more from our discussion, that priority is being given now again to real economy considerations, to job growth, to decent job growth, to poverty, to inequalities, all those concerns, as opposed to just tweaking the economy to make sure the inflation remains stable, to ensure the financial markets continue to remain in function. Put differently, the fiscal policy's role has become much more pronounced and that of monetary policy has become a little bit on the backseat and become a little more supportive role. And I think that's for the right reasons. If you look back a little bit of history, these kind of cycles have gone through before as well. After the World War II, all the way up until the early 1970s, there was a heyday of government-led fiscal policy led in giving shape to the economy, running of the economy, right? And it was a very, very successful period on many accounts. And then it was inspired, intellectually speaking, from Keynes's ideas. And starting from early to mid 70s, inspired by ideas of Hayek and Friedman, came the role of the private sector, and the government eventually took back seat. And it was understood that, okay, government should not try and actively intervene in the economy and only provide what I call enabling environment and supportive role to the businesses. I'm not going into the details of why this is, I'm just making a very simple point. That became fashionable. What I mean by fashionable is we must understand and appreciate the power of narratives. So it became a narrative that the businesses are the beacon of efficiency and all that is good, and the state or the government is all that is all that is bad. They are corrupt, they're inefficient, they don't know what to do, and so forth. That narrative actually has been ingrained in policymaking over a good 20, 30 years and has serious implications how we run or conceive actually policies, right? Let me give you a very simple example from my own experience. I know back in late 90s, Bank of England separated the monetary policy function from the financial stability function in terms of having two separate institutions. And a lot of pressure was exerted on a lot of developing countries, including Pakistan, to follow suit through IMF and into IMF programs, for instance, in case of Pakistan, that Pakistan central bank should only focus on monetary policy and a different institution should be created to run or to try to have stable financial markets. It has profound implications. But we were inspired and influenced by ideas. That's the example I'm trying to highlight. The globalization of ideas filters through certain narratives that are set by contexts which are not very specific to developing countries at times. When we have these kind of sessions, the role of government, primarily talking from a developing country's perspective and more so from a South Asian perspective, it is all the more important, I think, we really reflect and take stock of these, a little bit of historical trends and come up with genuine and original ideas of our own, because we, I think, from a region think tank, researchers, policymakers understand the context, the realities of our economy is far better than many other contexts, right? So that's the kind of flow that is important to really understand how these cycles take place. Some ideas become fashionable at times, they disappear. At the time of 2008 crisis, people thought this time is going to be different. People are going to respond. And now there's a genuine big global shock and people will now do policies differently. One major contributing role to the 2008 crisis, as we all know now, was all about a very, very, what you call hyper-globalization, or too much emphasis or too much weight given to the private sector, privatization, deregulation, backseat of the rail of the government. And that was a big contributing factor to how things happen, especially in the US, where the entire crisis started and then spread to the rest of the world, right? But everybody thought this crisis should not be, the opportunity posed by that crisis should not be lost. However, it turned out to be not to be the case. What happened in practice again, that after initial response to the 2008 global financial crisis, government stepped in, tried to support, have all sorts of expansionary roles. They were asked to step back by leading institutions like IMF and World Bank, and some sort of austerity kicked in once again. The vulnerabilities in the economies, the persistence of poverty, the rise of inequalities, the climate change that is taking place, all those issues were sort of pushed in the background and saying, well, they'll be taken care of once again we have a rapid economic growth led by the private sector businesses and so on and so forth, and things will be all right. You might have heard this term, there will be overall some sort of trickle down happening eventually. Well, that was a mistake, because this is something, again, this current crisis induced by COVID-19 pandemic has again made it all the more bare in front of us. All these vulnerabilities in front of us. People were, and governments were scrambling for help, for support, right? So the economies, the structures were not ready. So this time, this crisis should not be go to waste, in my opinion. That is why this session to me is extremely, extremely important. what is or should be the role of the government? Can we reimagine the role of government? And we're talking in the economics context, so it has, of course, connotations with the role of fiscal policy, what role it plays. We cannot work in isolation of economic policy being done separately by one entity and then figure out somehow social and environment considerations will be taken care of as some other arm of the government. There are concerns and issues that needs to be discussed in a holistic manner. In the interest of time, and I'm deliberately buying time, so Rathin and Saturvedi joins, but let me wrap up on my own remarks at least. If I can recommend one particular speaker, one particular researcher these days that I think all of us should pay attention to, what leading these kind of ideas is Mariana Mazzucato. I think she's based at UCL. She's talking a lot about and written a lot about the role of the state as a lead innovator, right? That's worth exploring. She's basically saying all the hype, all the narrative that we have, that primarily the innovations that take place in the economy, all the technological advancements, whether it's Google, the US space programs, internet, medical research, you name it, essentially was funded by the public resources, by the government initially, and eventually it was taken on by the private sector. State or the government can be a lead innovator. What I'm proposing is should be the lead innovator. They should set the scene for that. The natural question is, do the governments have the capacity to do that, especially in the South Asian context, especially in the developing countries context? Are the government bureaucrats, government officials have the capacity? Are they up to speed to try and understand these trends and come up with policy solutions on their own? To which extent are they going to remain influenced by global narratives set outside their context, as set by IMF and World Bank and others for some different reasons? And we end up adopting those things. Let's reimagine the role of the government as we embark further in the pursuit of 2030 agenda and for the 21st century. So that's a little bit of a context setting for the conversation, why, when Sajid and I spoke, why we wanted to have this kind of session so we can discuss these things. And I'm very honored actually to be joined by extremely distinguished panelists to shed further lights. So we're going to start the conversation now. Sajid, before I invite my speakers, do we have confirmation for Dr. Rathin Roy?
No, we haven't yet received. I've been continuously following him, but haven't. Most probably maybe some problem because we are missing both Indian panelists. Some technical issues maybe.
Could be. Anyways, so let me start with the other speakers first. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's totally on your hand now.
Okay.
Totally.
Good. Thank you. So let me move on to our first speaker then, and that would be Dr. Fahmida Khatun. Now, she's a familiar face now in the policy circle and think tank circle. Dr. Fahmida Khatun is the executive director of the Center for Policy Dialogue, which is a leading think tank in South Asia. She has a master's degree in economics from Jahangirnagar University, Bangladesh. She has another master's degree in environment and natural resources economics and a PhD in economics from the University College, London. She's actually also held a postdoctoral research fellowship at the Earth Institute, Columbia University as a Fulbright scholar. So a very warm welcome, Dr. Fahmida Khatun, to the panel. Let me pose you a very specific question, and I'll allow SG, before I get into the question, just a small point I forgot to highlight in terms of theory. So the first round of questions, each speaker will be requested to limit their interventions to about maximum 5 minutes, if you can. And then we'll try to have more interactive discussion, and then you'll have another opportunity to elaborate a few of your points further. And towards the end, if time permitting, I'll again come back to each speaker for their final thoughts if they really want to zero in on one aspect and they think it's worth highlighting. Okay, so Dr. Fahmida Khatun, let's start with the first broader question. So in the context of pursuing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, now, as I was indicating, governments have realized that they must give priority to people. By that I mean is to decent jobs, to health systems, social protection systems, and so forth, and planet or environmental considerations. There are issues of pollution, there are issues of serious environmental degradation. Climate change probably is by far most defining challenge of our times. We need to prioritize. It's a realization now that governments need to prioritize people and planet over just economic prosperity, which is typically measured by GDP growth dynamics. A lot of economic conversation just focus about GDP going up, GDP going down, it's going up by X%, by Y%, and I think we're missing the point, right? So we want to pay attention to people and product. So are you satisfied in this background with the policies that are being pursued by governments in this vein, primarily in Southeast Asia, or you can give examples from Bangladesh as well? Number one. Number two, what major changes do you expect to take place in government's priorities, government's policies and priorities? What do you think is constraining them to respond effectively, to build what we call resilient, inclusive, and sustainable economies and societies? Is it because of lack of resources, lack of vision, lack of capacity, lack of ability? What are your views on that? Dr. Fahmida Khatun, the floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamza Malik, for this introduction. And I would like to also thank SDPI for organizing this annual event. Consecutively, you have been working towards organizing this such a mega workshop and seminar for the last 23 years. That's what I learned. So the questions you have posed, I think the responses emanate from the context you have set at the beginning. I think you have covered quite a lot in terms of what the role should be with respect to dealing with the COVID pandemic and also afterwards. From taking cue from your context, I would like to respond what you have posed to be that the 2030 agenda, and particularly the issue of sustainable development by taking care of the environmental degradation and also by taking care of the planet. I think when a pandemic or economic disaster of such scale happen, countries which are limited or which are constrained by resources, financial resources, their target is to firstly to keep people afloat by ensuring food and nutrition at the beginning, and also by ensuring job security. So that's the because the extent of the pandemic is overwhelming for these countries, and since resources are limited, the focus first goes on how to maintain the economic and social achievements which have been achieved in the last couple of decades or so. Now, the issue of climate change or environment is generally neglected in many of these countries. I can particularly say in the context of Bangladesh and some of the South Asian countries, though these countries are at the receiving end of the impact of climate change because of the economic activities of the developed countries. Many of these countries, including Bangladesh, are the victims of the impact of climate change. Now, before COVID-19, I can speak for Bangladesh is that yes, sustainable development goals were and still are at the heart of economic policies, economic planning, and the goals have been streamlined or aligned with the sectoral goals of Bangladesh, and also the midterm policies. For example, the 5-year plan, 7th 5-year plan, now the 8th 5-year plan is being formulated. So those are at the heart of it. However, as you have mentioned, that since the priority is to look after the economic needs, then governments sometimes get carried away with the growth numbers also. The gross domestic product or the per capita income, these become the major indicators of their successes. And in the recent past, you must have noticed that there was a big hue and cry or discussion after the IMF announced the growth numbers that Bangladesh's per capita income will be higher than India's per capita income, and there were a lot of discussions in both the countries. However, the crux of the issue is that, as you have rightly mentioned, that GDP is not an indicator of welfare of people, and GDP does not also take care of the environment. Sometimes there are conflicting measures because when you focus too much on, or when you are overwhelmed by the GDP numbers, your attention will be to just to focus on that by ignoring the environmental degradation aspect. And sometimes we, as you know, that GDP is nothing but what is transacted in the market. So if you even cut down a forest and sell in the market, that accounts for your GDP growth. So that type of growth we don't we don't want. And COVID-19 has re-emphasized the need for a green economy, as we have seen that the European countries are investing heavily on green recovery, and some other countries also of the East Asian region, for example, South Korea, China, they are also investing heavily on green economic recovery. So I think the South Asian countries should not give an excuse of financial constraint, because it can be accommodated. There's no, it can't be separated. It should be an integrated way, so that when we are talking about many, you highlighted about the fiscal policies taking the front seat. So when we also, take fiscal policies should incorporate the issue of green economy or the issue of, climate change. So investment for economic recovery or the revival of the economies in the region, lot of measures are already being taken, and also in the future more will be undertaken. And governments have taken stimulus packages, mostly in the form of fiscal policies. However, I think the issue of environmental aspect is neglected in those stimulus packages, mostly. So this requires an awareness also, and reorient ourselves to think in terms of environmental development or environmental sustainability and economic sustainability, because that sustainability is at the core of economic growth. Otherwise, it's
One more
not
minute, Dr.
going
Fahmida.
to be inclusive. I think, yeah, I can stop here. Maybe the question
No,
and answer session we will.
I see your point. I'll come back to you actually and pick your brains on the specific points that you highlighted, the need for green economy, how to do that. The government acknowledges the climate challenges, but they still focus on GDP growth. So what needs to happen in the governments to change that mindset? So I'll come back to that a bit later. But let's moving on to our next distinguished panelist. And I think Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi is still encountering some technical difficulties, I gather. Sajid?
Yes, you're absolutely right.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
So that's okay. We'll keep our fingers crossed if I hope they manage to overcome these problems. Let's move on then to Dr. Dushni Weerakoon. Again, a very familiar name, a very accomplished professional. Dr. Dushni is the Executive Director of the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka, IPS, and head of its Macroeconomic Policy Research. She joined IPS back in 1994 after her doctorate and has written and published widely on macro issues, trade, integration issues, international economics, and so on and so forth. She has extensive experience in public policy engagement, which is very critical for a lot of academic economists to actually have the exposure to policy making. So it's great to have her on the panel. And she's actually served the government of Sri Lanka as an appointed member of the Monetary Board of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Trade and Productivity Commission, Committee on Trade Policy Formulation, Trade and Tariff Committee, Committee of Experts to negotiate the South Asian Free Trade Agreement, Macro and Trade Policy Steering Committee, among several others. So as you can see, Dr. Dushni has very extensive experience, not only of very solid academic background, but also a very hands-on and practical experience engaging with the government and advising governments on several fronts. So Dr. Dushni, in today's world, when the governments of developing countries are faced with a host of challenges, right? We talked about some like climate change is there, persistence of poverty is the issue in South Asia. Right now, the economic growth is tanking. That's emerging issues. People don't have access to health and social protection system and so on and so forth, right? So government is faced with several policy pandemic, which has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. We also have less than effective multilateralism now, is also an issue. And in your experience as a trade economist, I think you'll understand probably better than others. So the need for integrated, what we call a whole of government and whole of society approach is needed, because the issues are so diverse and they span over traditional silos of economic, social, and environment kind of pillars approach, right? So we need a what we call integrated or whole of government approach to policy making. It's a need of the hour. We all understand that. Now, given your extensive experience in public policy engagement, how do you see the situation? Are you satisfied, as, in other words, whether the integrated policy approach is indeed happening in Sri Lanka or in South Asia in general? The general public perception tends to be that there is lack of effective coordination between different government policy arms and public policy units and ministries and organizations and so on and so forth. It tends to be a perception. Now, whether it's true or not, that's a different story. In general, I think we can agree with that observation, that public does not really have trust, right, of the government, because they think they don't know who's doing what. At the end of the day, they're seeing weak public service delivery coming from the government side. So in this context, how do you propose, what's your advice that the governments can actually address this fragmentation of policymaking, so to speak, so that an integrated or whole of government approach can be promoted? Over to you, Dr. Dushni.
Thank you, and Dr. Malik, and let me also add my congratulations to SDPI for getting this annual conference off the ground in very difficult circumstances. When it comes to public policy making, and I will start with Sri Lanka. We've done research on the political economy constraints to reforms, and it's clear that over the last 2-3 decades there have been significant changes, because Sri Lanka went through a very early reform process, first in South Asia to do so in the late 70s, and we had a second phase of reforms in the early 90s when many of the other South Asian countries also went through economic reform programs. But since then, I don't think any South Asian country has managed to undertake a substantive reform process. It has been rather piecemeal, ad hoc, and I think there are very common reasons why this has sort of happened in terms of the governance and institutional factors that seem to be common to most of our countries. One is the tensions or fractious nature of two-party political systems. One that has come in the literature is that. And second is that the bureaucracy has become increasingly politicized in all our countries, which means that with every change of government, we have a very sort of small insider sort of advisors or outsiders coming in to work with the government, but they may leave and there is no sort of institutionalization of those reform processes. And as a result, the bureaucracy are also not, in some sense, conversant with taking a long-term view on what reform strategies to be put in place and implemented. So to me, the COVID-19 experience has in some sense highlighted these gaps. To a large extent, how we've dealt with the COVID-19 here in Sri Lanka is that various task forces have been quickly put together to look at the health side of it, or to look at the economic recovery side of it. And these are sort of drawing people in from multiplicity of ministries and departments that we have. But there are, I think, clear lessons also to be learned from that, and hopefully some of the silver linings of COVID-19 will be that there is a better understanding that these processes need to be institutionalized, that we must be prepared to face similar pandemics in the future. COVID-19 is not going to be it's not the end of similar crises that are going to hit countries individually or collectively, and that the bureaucracy needs to be better prepared. So to that extent, I see that many of the lessons that have been learned will hopefully find its way into how we look at disaster management frameworks in a broader context. We do have disaster management frameworks, but these are targeted specifically at looking at climate-related disasters, etc. But I think the COVID-19 has opened all our eyes to the fact that we need to coordinate between health, between education, between public security, all of these things. And government, the role of governments clearly has changed. Not only have we seen governments being more directly involved in the delivery of health and education services, etc., but we've also seen the direct involvement of armed forces, etc., in the quarantine process. So the state has come forward in a strong way. How that will shape the future sort of relationships in terms of accountability, credibility, and trust is, I think, something that needs to be looked at, studied, and lessons learned, not only from South Asia, but from the rest of the world as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Dushni, for this very succinct and to the point, bringing in the political economy angle and the issues pertaining to the political system that are common, I think, in a lot of South Asian countries, including Sri Lanka. The politicization of bureaucracy, actually, the ones who actually carry out the agenda of governments across the governments. Very, very fundamental points. We'll come back and get into a little more specifics on those things. But for now, let me move on to our next speaker. And I'm just confirming with Sajid. Again, still no luck with Dr. Sachin and Dr. Rathin, right?
No, unfortunately not.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Why you're sorry? It's all right. We'll come back.
You can ask Sachin's question to Sajid as well.
I was
assume
assume
Sajid is Sachin.
We can certainly get in much more interactive, and I see a lot of questions are coming up as well, so we can have much more interactive discussion. We already have very, very nice speakers already. So let me move on now to our old friend, Dr. Abid Suleri. He doesn't need an introduction, actually, especially in SDPI conference. But let me just make sure everybody, those who are not familiar with Dr. Abid, know him now. Dr. Abid is the Executive Director of SDPI, a Senior Research Fellow as well. He has been with the SDPI for more than a decade now, I think since 2007. His research interests primarily include food security and sustainable economic growth issues. He's a member of many government and non-governmental forums and bodies. So just like Dr. Dushni, he has both very solid academic background as well as engagement with policymaking at a country level, which is an extremely valuable asset. You'll trust me, in South Asia context, you don't find too many solid economists having very direct exposure to public policy making. So he's a member of Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Pakistan's Climate Change Commission, National Advisory Committee of Planning Commission, advisory think tank of Ministry of National Food Security and Research, and convener of Working Group on Food Security under the Strategic Policy Planning Cell. He's now also serving at the advisory board of CAREC, the Central Asia's Regional Economic Cooperation Think Tank Network, and several other organizing committees. So Dr. Abid, I was hoping, actually, Dr. Dushni's remarks pretty much set the scene for you to shed further light on the same theme when she mentioned the capacity in a way of bureaucracy. She used the term they have been politicized and indirectly was highlighting that their probably effectiveness has been compromised a little bit in the process. So let me ask you directly in the context of Pakistan. So Pakistan, as you all know, has been repeatedly bailed out by the International Monetary Fund over the last 30 years or so, about 14 occasions. So a little over 2.5 years on average, they've been bailed out, irrespective of the political governments in power, right? That's a very important point to know. So something is wrong, economically speaking, not just politically speaking. This has contributed to the erosion of independent economic policy making in Pakistan. They have borrowed ideas, I think, from this institution because they've been engaged quite directly with these organizations, which has in a way weakened the capacity of government officials in the process. This is something that Dushni was also alluding to. To which extent do you think the governments of tomorrow, which is the theme of this session, should rely on external advice compared to domestic policy-making capacity? In going forward, how do you reimagine the role of the government? A government that has the capacity to deal with a crisis, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, or in Dr. Dushni's words, have a much more disaster management framework in a broader sense. A government that has the ability to formulate and implement its own policy priorities, and a government that is fully cognizant of the needs of the people. What changes would you advise that the government of Pakistan undertake this in this vein? Over to you, Dr. Abid.
Well, thank you, Hamza. I think I'll like to start from your initial comments, and you actually made a very valid point: monetary policy versus fiscal stimulus or fiscal policy, and then who runs the show. Of course, on one hand, we would like to see an independent regulator, and when we like to see an independent regulator, we are talking of more autonomy, where monetary policy is actually discussed and designed and announced. And on top of it, what one can see, and I'm purely talking from a political economy point of view, a lot of reactions on monetary policy, which is not linked with fiscal realities. And that is in the normal period. Now, when we're talking of new normal in the context of COVID, I think one thing that we need to make sure, let's forget the numbers, the GDP, the current account deficit, fiscal account deficit, increase in debt, debt to GDP ratio, etc. Because 2020, if you will look back, maybe a decade from now or 2 decades from now, all one would see is an outlier, which perhaps would be difficult to explain from any other economic principles. Now, the first argument is that the governments who would be perhaps at the cost of all sort of deficit, who could invest in future, even in Pakistan context, we have been borrowing money for all sort of our expenditures. But now if the borrowing is done to actually invest in human capital, borrowing is done to keep this fiscal expansion for at least another year, that would be sort of investment which would make foundations for a stronger GDP and a stronger economy, maybe 2 years down the road or 3 years down the road. Today's austerity, I would say that perhaps would do more damage than any benefit. So that is my first point. But in order to do it, and you also mentioned about this bureaucratic hurdles and all of that, I think unless and until we have some sort of clarity and some sort of alignment between the key institutions who are taking decisions on economy, and I'm talking of all sort of economic ministries, as it's not only finance ministry, it is Ministry of Planning and Reforms, it's Ministry of Industries, it's Ministry of Commerce, it's State Bank of Pakistan, and Board of Investment, Economic Affairs Division. So unless and until we have some sort of alignment and some sort of understanding, this intra-ministerial and interdepartmental linkages, perhaps we can't come up with, the government can't come up with a state recipe for future. The second thing, which is equally important, and I'll suggest all the participants here, delegates here, there is an excellent one-pager in this week's Economist by Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of opposition in England, and he's talking about the role of government, and he highlighted 4 important factors. He's saying the leadership credibility, transparency, leadership credibility. He's talking of speed. You also mentioned the speed by which government has to take decision. He's talking of preparedness, and he's talking of better global cooperation. I think in our context, all the 4, but preparedness is again something that often gets ignored. So we may have even coordination, we may have good policies, but if we are not prepared to implement those policies, and there is a whole world of difference between what is said and what is actually practiced, I don't see that the government would be able to do much. So again, summing up, this is the year for human investment. Governments, they should, for the time being, ignore GDP growth, fiscal deficit, increase in debt, etc. As long as they are investing those debts in human capital, in social protection, in fiscal expansion, better coordination between fiscal policy and monetary policy, and getting better prepared and acting at a speed of light, I would say. Your mic.
Yeah. My mouse was stuck. Sorry. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Abid, for a very succinct and very clear points that you have highlighted. More coordination, more effective coordination among different government arms. You gave us specific examples of monetary and fiscal policy. Need for government to continue investing. I couldn't agree more. In current circumstances, there should not be any talk of austerity in the near-term horizon. And I come from a central banking background, by the way, so I understand your point. And then the preparedness of the government, I mean, the speed with which they have to respond, and then rather than responding to crisis, preparing for them beforehand so they don't find themselves in this kind of situation, the kind of point that Dr. Dushni was highlighting. Now, I come back to, okay, let me again double check with Sajid. Sajid, we're still moving on with the assumption that Ratin Roy and Arsad
same status.
Same status. So I think there's some very serious technical issues they are encountering. Otherwise, we would have loved to have hear their views as well. So that's good news for Abid, Dushni, and Fahmida. You'll get more time now. And I want to get into the specifics. Now, all of you sort of put differently, laid out very clearly the diagnosis part. What is the problem? And I'm glad you guys did that. But let's try to now, let me pick your brain a bit more and say, okay, if you are giving, people say if you become prime minister for one day, what would you do? So now if you have put you in that seat and say, now you have identified the problems very clearly, diagnosis is very spot on and ideas are very clear, what to do about that, right? So let me come back in the same order, and then I'll probably ask if each of you from different kind of questions being raised, issues being raised by different panelists, right? So let me, in the first round, come back now to Dr. Fahmida. She highlighted, first of all, the need for essentially the government is facing resource constraints, right? So barely keeping afloat, that's one fundamental reason they are not been able to do that. She acknowledged that the climate change is there, the big problem. The governments are like Bangladesh, is the receiving end of such a big crisis. It's a climate emergency globally, and yet the focus tends to be on typically GDP numbers. Why there's a disconnect? I mean, a lot of people, if you talk to government officials, they'll all acknowledge the reality of climate change. If you talk to government officials, they'll all highlight the need, importance of investing in education and health and social protection systems. Some people are commenting on these lines as well. And we all understand that, right? And your experience, you have exposed to that. What to do about it? You're saying there's a need for green recovery and green economy, and fiscal policy should play a role in that way. So if you can share some very specific ideas how to do that now, right? So there's a problem that the government, despite acknowledging the challenge of climate change, for instance, faced with resource constraints, should pursue green economy through fiscal policy. How to do that? How do they do that? What would be your advice? Do this thing is particularly, any example or any ideas? Dr. Fahmida, floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Malik. Once again, I think I'll have to start again, little bit of, with little bit of diagnosis again, taking cue of Dushni. I think political economy plays a very important role here, and people also want to see immediate result, immediate outcome. That is the real issue. Sometimes some investments take time to give results. So environmental issue is something that overnight it doesn't get deteriorated, but gradually, and then one fine morning you find that disasters have really happened which are beyond recovery or beyond amendment. So that's the issue. But I think some of the realizations over time has come, particularly in the context of Bangladesh. It has been highlighted at the highest level of the leadership. However, when on the ground, when policies are to be formulated, then we sort of move away from the focal focus. I think specific lack of awareness is one of the important issues, of course, because and there is also a disjoint or lack of coordination between the ministries which are at the helm of distributing or allocating resources, and ministries which are at the other end to take actions at the sectoral level. Because here in this case, unless and until a ministry which is in charge of the environment or climate change, they are also powerful as the Ministry of Finance, or if they do not have a negotiating capability with the Ministry of Finance, then the problem arises. We quite often observe that in many countries, particularly in developing and least developed countries, so these ministries are a bit weaker.
We get that, Dr. Fahmida. We got that. Yes. I think Dushni highlighted that. Abid was alluding to that as well. You reiterated the point. What to do about it? What would you recommend the government they should improve the coordination?
First thing, taking care, from your introduction and also the discussion had happened, the fiscal issue is a real problem, because when we are discussing about fiscal policies and more public expenditure, so here to deal with any crisis, more public expenditure is the important issue, is the solution actually. So we governments have to actually invest more on green investment. For example, if we have if we have to create more jobs, investment is the critical issue here.
So sorry to interrupt again, but Dr. Fahmida.
However, if we can, invest in green transportation, green building, green energy. So these are the areas where government can invest more, and this also gives, dividend in the medium to long term.
Understood. So you're saying if the government has the resources, they should invest in these green areas, and that is going to be helpful. But that still does not address the direct question that you yourself alluded to. Does having resources is enough? I don't think so. There is the issue of effectiveness, the coordination, right?
Yeah.
So there may be lack of priorities, actually, lack of coordination leading to the lack of priorities. Ministry X want to invest in certain areas, Ministry Y wants certain areas. Who's going to call the shots at the end of the day? Do we have any examples from globally or from the South Asia region where you can say, okay, this is one specific example where this particular thing worked really well? We're talking primarily zeroing a little bit on the coordination, interministerial, inter-policy unit coordination. And I'll pick the same little theme with Dushni and Abid as well. But any example you're aware of where such green investments are taking place through effective coordination?
For example, waste management is one thing which has been taken care of not at the municipal level. So that is working, and then, because this is also coming from the bottom, the need of the citizens that has been pronounced well, and so that has been taken noticed by the municipal corporations and the municipal officials. So that is one thing. Usually what happens in case of climate issues, environmental issues, it doesn't work when it comes from the top. So it has to come from the bottom, and that has been very successful. And also in case of many other, in the semi-urban areas, there are examples where the communities have taken initiatives to revive the water bodies and all. So that community level involvement is the critical issue here. So involvement of the people who are the direct stakeholder, that's important.
Very interesting, very specific actually. So you're basically saying a bottom-up approach in a sense. Engagement of the local policymakers at the municipal level, engagement with local communities helps give shape to people's priorities, and that should then feed into the national policy making, if I may put it that way, right? Okay, and that kind of leads to automatically clarity on prioritization and maybe coordination between different units. Let's hold on to that thought. Dr. Dushni, you stated something extremely important: the politicized bureaucracy and even the two-party political system as a constraint. But let's put aside the two-party political system for a second. I'll come back to that if time permitting. But you said something very, very clear. The government should have a disaster management approach in a much more broader sense, not only in the sense of dealing with this crisis, climate or COVID, but in general be prepared, like Abid was highlighting, the importance of being prepared before a crisis hit, right? And that's, to me, is a basic essence of disaster management approach. So climate crisis is an ongoing, unfolding crisis. It's happening. You don't have to wait for a flood to happen and say, oh, what do we do now, right? So that's extremely important observation. How do you think the politicized bureaucracy is inhibiting the implementation of such an approach, and what to do about it? How do you depoliticize bureaucracy and then try and go after a framework that is what you were saying, a disaster management kind of thinking?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't blame the bureaucracy for the lack of integrated disaster management framework and implementation. I'll take an example of Sri Lanka. After the December 2004 tsunami, we went through a whole disaster management sort of, rewiring, came up with the frameworks, came up with the ministry, came up with systems to test this at periodic levels to see whether, if you use mobile alerts, community, so the message reaches the communities, how long does it take them then to be reallocated to safer places, etc. But I mean, quite frankly, I can say that the effectiveness of those plans and policies in place over time, once the immediate crisis, the memories recede, we don't pay that much attention. It's something that, you tick a box to say, well, we had the a dry test run of it and everything works perfectly. But when the next disaster strikes, we realize that so much of it has been ignored. So
what do you do about this?
Exactly. I mean, what to do about it? And I feel that pinning the blame on the bureaucracy alone is not fair, because to a large extent, I think sometimes the bureaucracy themselves are not given the powers, or they're not given the authority. They are sidelined as temporary sort of structures and institutions and frameworks are brought in to deal with a particular disaster and then dismantled after we have overcome that. So there is, I think the solution really is to give voice to the bureaucracy, because even in Sri Lanka we have a very large bureaucracy, but capable if they are given the authority and the autonomy to act independently.
Well, somebody might argue that they already have too much authority.
Yeah, maybe in certain countries in South Asia, but by and large, I think the independence that the bureaucracy had has sort of eroded over time. I mean, at least that's my experience of here in Sri Lanka.
Fair enough.
That there has been certain positive changes we have seen. For instance, Sri Lanka had about 55 cabinet ministries and another 40 state ministries, but there was a change in through the constitution to limit the numbers of ministries and state ministries. So that in itself means a more streamlined bureaucracy. It means that individual ministries are given responsibilities to ensure that over at least a 5-year electoral term, they have certain deliverables to do and implement. So little changes, but in a positive way. Hopefully, these will sort of get more ingrained and become part of our institutional culture. Okay. And I pretty much agree with what Abid said also about accountability. That sort of
Okay, so you're for basically giving more space and power and authority to bureaucracies to make them effective, and in the process, you think they'll become depoliticized and hence will contribute to maybe the disaster management framework or any other capacities, right? That's the upshot of the entire thing. Fair enough. That's a fair point. I mean, valid point. You can't just lay the blame, all the blame with the bureaucrats themselves. There has to be a debate on that issue. I mean, both sides has to be considered. For instance, in Pakistan or in many other South Asian countries also, one reason why central banks tend to perform, relatively speaking, better on many accounts, that's globally true actually, not just South Asian context, because they have been given space and authority, independence. So one basic element of independence has to be the ability to hire professional staff for the job that is needed, rather than having generalists incorporated who don't know anything about that particular area and expected them to deliver something. That's in 21st century, that's a really unreasonable expectation, but that tends to be the bureaucratic model typically. Somebody has a background in English literature, ends up running finance ministry. Well, you can't expect somebody to come up with a visionary kind of ideas and and drastic changes that are needed, right? So, but to which extent you go? Because then if the one institution, one ministry becomes too effective, authoritative, clear, starts delivering on their part, the issue of coordination emerges between other authorities, between other arms. That's what I think Abid was highlighting. So for instance, over the years in Pakistan, the example of Abid, monetary policy became a little more independent, much more effective. They were hiring professionals, so on and so forth, over 2 or 3 decades. They've become far more stronger in many ways, in terms of technical capacity, research capacities, and even legally speaking, the governor, central bank tends to have a lot of space, policy to do. But then there are issues still being discussed, and Abid rightly alluded to those things, the issue of coordination, right? That's what Dr. Fahmida was also highlighting earlier. She was giving an example at the municipal and the engagement with the community level. So Abid, coming to you on this particular point, you summarized 3 things very, very clearly. Government should continue to invest. For that, they need very, very effective coordination between different arms, and they need to be prepared for the crisis. Among the 4 criteria that you mentioned, among one of them is prepared rather than respond to the crisis. So how do we go after making effective governments coordinate effectively between the different arms and institutions? The kind of theme we have picked up in the second round. Any specific ideas you think are worth exploring?
Well, of course, there is no magic wand for it. But if you remember, in Pakistan, we were discussing to have some sort of an economic cluster. Some sort of all the ministries and departments dealing with economy. Talking of different clusters. Similarly, in this institutional reforms, the work that Ishrat Hussain has been pursuing, Dr. Ishrat Hussain has been pursuing. Again, he hinted that there can be different clusters of ministries. One particular cluster which is dealing with all sort of economic matters, other which is dealing with the social sector development, and still other which is dealing with the foreign affairs and other ministries. Now, again, if I remember correctly, some of the recommendation that Dr. Ishrat Hussain gave last time, it included that the bureaucracy who would be serving in this economic cluster after grade 20, they should just keep on serving in that cluster. So it's not that you take the chairman FPR and appoint her as a promotion to Secretary Culture and Heritage. So of course, you mean you are losing out on our experience. So our lifelong experience that she gained, and then because she's in grade 22 now, and you wanted to promote her, and you appoint her as Secretary Culture. And I'm not trying to say that Secretary Culture is any less important position.
No, you're making a specific example.
Yeah. But these sort of things, I think they need to come to an end. The second is when we are talking of preparedness, we need to have some sort of foresight in mind. For example, in our specific case, we have already now seen this pandemic, this black swan event turning into a reality. The second black swan event may be scarcity of water. It may be the pure climatic disaster. And again, we have more than a dozen institutions that deal with those disasters, starting from National Disaster Management, NDMA, to local DDMA and PDMA and all sort. So anticipating in advance that what is it that can challenge the governments in next 5 to 10 years, and then preparing accordingly. Another big issue, I think, that requires coordination. It is after this acceleration. So now this technology that we are used to up. So we would be still doing our work through this PUC, paper under consideration, and then file it goes and takes 10 days to reach to secretary office, and then 10 days back to section officer's office. So obviously, if we are now living in new normal, we need to not only reimagine the role of government, but also reimagine the role of doing those works. And if that can be done, perhaps coordination would be improved.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Abid. This is a very specific example. I think you built on Dushni's observation in the sense of continuation is important, right? And you gave a very specific example how to do that. So make sure somebody who has served in a certain economic cluster continues to remain in that cluster, so they remain much more productive and effective in the process, rather than having short tenure in the sense, right? So that's a very specific example of. So the issue becomes is importance of coordination, and for that you need very effective bureaucracy, and to make them effective, you need some sort of continuation of ideally professional expertise in that area, right? That's a kind of one very specific example. Good. Let me go back to the floor actually now, and they have some specific questions for panelists, and in some cases so specific panelists, and in some cases more general questions. I'm all asking this question in no particular order, so I'm just going to try and group them somewhat related one. Let me start from one more latest one by Mr. Imran Khalid, and it is addressed to all panelists in general. So if the capacities do exist, how should the government prioritize its actions? What should the prioritization process look like? If I may add, what should be the priorities? We have talked about that, what should be the priorities? Like Dr. Fahmida said, invest in green economy, for instance. But I think the question is from Mr. Imran Khalid is, what should the prioritization process look like when we want to go after making the capacities, and if the capacities are developed? Anybody wants to take a shot at that? Okay.
I've just spoken, so maybe Dushni or Fahmida.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Just before that, let me also clarify a little bit the prioritization during pandemic or afterwards.
The question is in the context of we're talking about the government's capacity and the continuation and those kind of things, the bureaucracy. So the question is saying if the capacities actually do exist or are developed, then how do you develop the prioritization process? So whether, I think it's a general question, COVID or in general, basically.
Yeah, in general, yes, I think COVID has exposed the need for more capacity building, no doubt about it. This has been highlighted throughout this session. This COVID-19 has reiterated that, how to improve the capacity of the government and or government officials. And as you have mentioned, taking cue from your earlier point when I was talking that, it's not only about the investment, but also the quality of investment. Now, in order to improve the quality of investment, you also have to improve the quality of human resources. That's very important. And in order to ensure the quality of human resources, the professionalism which has been there, I think in the past, which is being eroded over time, I see that has to be, highlighted, or that has to be in place because of the interference from the from politics, the bureaucratic efficiency has been deteriorated extensively. So the de-link between the bureaucracy and professionalism with the political wings, that is quite important. And that also depends, it doesn't get materialized in isolation or in vacuum. That also has to come from the leadership, political leadership itself. So I would say that that is there's a pressure on the political leadership, and in order to change the modality of political leadership or improve the efficiency of the political leadership itself, people are the best player, I would say. The pressure has to come from the people themselves.
But Fahmida, there is a very interesting catch-22 situation that you're highlighting now. This one, and this is come back to the Dr. Dushni's earlier remark, the first round, the two-party system, right? So don't you think in a democratic two-party system, politicians have the right to say what needs to be done and what should be the priority in their governments, and bureaucrats are supposed to implement that? The issue, I think, then becomes of transparency, which actually is the exact question that somebody is asking. So I put it in that context. So I don't have the name of the person asking the question, but they're saying everything becomes useless in the absence of transparency and good governance. It should be the prime agenda of government during and after COVID-19, right? But how do you take, Dr. Dushni, you also alluded to earlier, and Dr. Fahmida was saying something slightly different. This tends to be the approach by technical people that, oh, if we are given a chance, we're going to do wonderful things with the country, right? But at the end of the day, it's a politician's job. We have to understand that. We are technical people, are essentially advisors, right? So how do you go after making sure that transparency and the governance element is improved in the bureaucracy, so there is clear articulation of priorities by politicians as the government, and a clear accountability of the bureaucrats to deliver those priorities of the government? If I can reframe the question a little bit. So what are the views on transparency and governance in this context? Dr. Dushni, I would like to start with you on that one.
Well, I mean, it brings us back to the whole issue of the politicization of the bureaucracy. Now, let's say we have two-party systems, we have regular changes of government, regular changes in policy. I think we can all live with that. But when you have a politicized bureaucracy, it means that the top bureaucrats that have worked with that regime also tends to get, sidelined and moved on. So there is the problem. So there is no institutional capacity building of an independent policy advisory and implementation arm, which is, I think, quite critical to deliver the kind of accountability and transparency in governance that we all want. So until and unless you find ways and means of ensuring that the bureaucracy is depoliticized and not under pressure, I think we are not going to solve the problems.
I hear you. So do you think some sort of ideas that Abid was alluding to, for instance, security of tenure of a senior bureaucrat in this example, like in case of central bank governors, their tenure is constitutionally ensured for 5 years or 3 years or 7 years, and in that they have a lot of space to do that, right? Abid was making a little more second-tier argument as well, how to make sure in economic clusters there's continuation of professional expertise, right? Do you think that's going to help? Depoliticize if you get more tenure to senior bureaucrats who have the professional competency. So irrespective of a political change, they continue in delivering what the overall priorities. Do you agree or no? Because the other side is, and the political governments want their own people to be running the show.
I don't consider that as a foolproof solution. For instance, I mean, we also have tenured bureaucracy, it's lifetime employment. But if you are not, if you don't want to work with a particular bureaucrat, you can just send them to the pool. So they will continue to draw the same salary and be in that same senior grades, but their talents are not being, yes, so they're not being deployed to get the best out of them.
So accountability becomes an issue, or some sort of, if they don't deliver, they should be fired. Is that what you are alluding to, or that's too extreme? Like New Zealand central bank constitution has a thing, if the governor does not deliver the stated inflation target, they can lose their job. So it can be the same thing if the federal secretary for finance cannot deliver on a stated medium-term fiscal deficit target, for instance, or borrowing targets, they should be fired from bureaucracy, not moved to some other ministry. Is that the direction you want to take, or that's too extreme for you? While you organize your thoughts, Abid, you want to pick up that conversation? You're mute, I think.
When we are talking of accountability of bureaucrats, one thing that immediately comes to mind that, okay, if they're not performing well, throw them out of job. But the first thing is, if you go a step back, do we really have any yardstick to measure their performance, or do they have any terms of preferences or any job description or goals? So if you will appoint someone at the highest level as a federal minister, as a federal secretary or additional secretary, and give them a generalist job description. So what would be, for example, your yardstick to measure their performance, and how you would say that a person, yes, you gave him or her the tenure protection. In case of governor central bank, yes, it's easy, but in case of other tiers of bureaucracy, how actually one would determine whether they delivered on their specified TORs or not? So if they have to do day-to-day firefighting, I would say that all of them, they are doing a pretty good job. As in Alice in Wonderland, if you don't know where to go, so whichever path you will follow, it will take you to the destination. So
okay. No, that's a good example, actually. I mean, defining clear job descriptions, TORs, because it adds to the transparency and accountability aspect. And that exactly was the question from the floor. That's why we're trying to tease out the effectiveness of bureaucracies delivering certain agendas. Let's change the tack a little bit. Let me take another question.
Can I just 30 seconds?
Sure.
I just want to also highlight the issue of institutional strengthening and institutional reforms. What has happened also with the politicization of the whole system? Institutions have been made very weak. And if the institution cannot work independently, then, no measures can be undertaken. So that's also integral part of that you give independence and the capacity and the flexibility of those institutions which can take actions against any irregularity or any low performance. Thank you.
Fair point. Excellent. Thanks for reminding us on that point. Okay. So this is a question from Dr. Ahmed P. Zada. I'm slightly going back to the earlier theme, and I'm going to combine the two themes of effectiveness of bureaucracy and what should they be prioritizing. So the question is, given historical experience, political economy often results in fiscal expenditures which are not necessarily investments in the future, right? We were all talking about need for fiscal authority to try and invest in the economy, green economy, Dr. Hamida's examples, and Abid also saying they should continue to invest, and so on and so forth. So getting around the political economy incentive is often much harder than we tend to assume in policy proposals. We can appreciate that. Can the panelists say something on the incentives that can be aligned with the long-term prosperity of the country? So how do you create incentives, I think, to bureaucrats effectively or even politicians to try and align the people's priorities and the actual policies that are being pursued? So for instance, people want social protection and more health systems. Government should be investing in those things. How do you give incentives to politicians and policymakers to go after those kind of policies, which are then exactly what people want? Because this is what we discussed earlier. This tends to be a disconnect. Governments are investing so much in so many things, and people in the end are saying, this is not what we want. Governments are piling up missiles and tanks and whatnot, and people are scrambling in hospitals nowadays in the COVID context. They don't have social protection system because investments are not there. How do you create incentives? That's the key word here. Who wants to volunteer on this one? Incentive creation.
Well, Hamza, I think here we are talking of communication, economic communication. So I would argue that an incentive, when we're talking of an incentive or when we're talking of cushion, and I very often get confronted by media people who ask me that, okay, so government is claiming that they have this current account surplus after a long gap. So how does it translate for the betterment of a common person? And I think that's where the economic policy managers and the governments, they have to communicate. And by communication, I would say that we have to somehow, without losing the academic depth or academic accuracy of things, we need to explain them in the simplest possible manner. If I will have current account surplus right now, I would be able to pay for imports of wheat if wheat is not available, or I would be able to buy vaccine if I have to, I don't get vaccine enough from the Gavi, things like that. But the problem is that the hardcore economists and the hardcore economic decision makers, when they just throw numbers and trends and charts, which are extremely important, without relating them to the common person's life, I think that's where a mismatch occurs, and that's where the aspirations they get diluted.
So if I understand you correctly, you're taking it as not exactly a question of incentives, actually, rather more of a communication angle.
I mean, incentive is, if you can make me understand why I should be on this panel, that would be an incentive for me. So if you just ask me that, Abid, you are an organizer, so you have to be here. So I may or I may not, but if you can communicate in a more effective manner, so that would be an incentive for me. I'm getting educated from the wonderful panel here and from all the questions which are being posted on the chat box. So this is an incentive.
So basically, yeah, your effective communication then becomes an instrument or a tool of transparency in the process, which helps facilitating alignment of incentives. That's essentially the upshot, right? Good. I think that's a very clear answer to the question. We have few more, there's some questions directly to me, which I will not bother. In the interest of time, I can try and reply separately because I'm just trying to tease out these distinguished panelists. That's my role today. There's one more question which I could change a little bit, but let me try and make it a little more general. This one, yeah. So this is from Dr. Rafi Amiruddin. They are essentially saying, given rampant poverty in South Asia in general, and even more severely affected by the pandemic, so again, the problem has been exacerbated of poverty, what can be done on an urgent basis to deal with this crisis while the countries want to pursue, he puts it, to ensure green recovery? So it's a way, in a way, coming back to the priorities part, which we clarified a little bit, the priority should be, in a more simplistic manner, green economic recovery. But at the same time, there are multiple challenges. So the question is, if there's rampant poverty, which has been exacerbated by pandemic, how do government address that at the same time pursuing green economic recovery? Do you see they're compatible? Do you see they're different? Dr. Fahmida, I think the question is addressed to you.
Yeah, I think, what I was trying to highlight also and flag, that we should not separate the two ventures, because green recovery would be integral part of the whole recovery from the COVID-19. That should be the, approach actually. And this is the time to take that approach. Now, in order to, reduce the rampant poverty, of course, what we are discussing, that public expenditure has to be increased, public investment has to be increased, and also more fiscal space has to be created, and direct cash transfer has to be given to the poor people. The ambit of social protection, that has to be expanded and universal. And this is also the time to introduce universal social safety net programs, which is absent in many, many countries of the world, and particularly in South Asian parts. So those guaranteed, schemes also are very important. So the targeted fiscal measures for the poor, that's important. But at the same time, green investment is also important, because, in any case of climate shocks, it is the poor who are the most affected, sections of the community. So you cannot really separate, and the whole outlook and approach has to be changed.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, so I mean, this need, I couldn't agree more, in the current context at least, the need for more fiscal space, public investments, and so on and so forth, whether for alleviating poverty or pursuing green economic recovery. That's perfectly compatible at the moment and needed. But then, linking with our conversation that we've had so far, it raises eyebrows of corruption, mismanagement, misallocation of precious or little resources, and so on and so forth. You keep giving more money to the government, and in the end, we don't see anything. And these kind of very traditional arguments that go against. So that's what I was alluding to in my opening remarks, that it tends to not help the countries in the end, rather damages the cause of public sector leading the development process, because then they say, look, you're given so much money and there's so much wastage out there. There are estimates, there's research on those lines. This is the kind of questions people were asking as well. There are 2-3 questions on these lines. One, we touched a little bit on transparency and accountability aspect, which should address this kind of concerns. But in general, the question still remains, what is the balance between the two? Just having the money or resources is not going to do the job. I know we had this couple of years ago, we had a minister from Nepal, and in one of the, we had a similar kind of conversation, and we had a very startling observation. He said government of Nepal is struggling with spending its allocated budget, and there are only 2 months left, and more than 40% of allocated money is there. And that is true for many, many developing countries. Again and again, as you go at the project level, a lot of allocated money, even from a very small pool, goes unspent. Then there are no clear links between what was spent actually was actually effective in delivering what was supposed to be delivered, and so on and so forth. So all I'm trying to say is the sheer fact of having more resources or fiscal space is not a guarantee to deliver the objectives if there is no effective governance, transparency, accountability, and those kind of priorities. And so I think I've just looked at my clock. Let's come back to the wrap-up session now. So if I can give you, I think we got some clarity, and I'll try and summarize in a minute. But before I do that, can I request each speaker to just 1 minute? If, you know, the way we normally tend to say is, if you have to grab a headline tomorrow's newspaper, what would be your catchy message out there for the audience? So 30 seconds, maximum 1 minute. What is the ultimate message from your side on the issue at hand? Let's go in reverse order now. Abid, Dushni, and then Dr. Fahmida. So Abid.
Well, I'll pick from your last point, and I think I'll make a qualitative audit compulsory along with quantitative audit. One of the problems with looking at this allocation and spending, that if we will just confine ourselves to numbers, 10 rupees were allocated, and if it's 10 rupees, 10 cent is the spending, it's an audit objection, and not so. Value for money and qualitative audit, that has to accompany quantitative audit.
Very specific, very direct, very pertinent. Thank you, Abid. Dr. Dushni, last word, one key message.
I mean, I think that what you alluded to in that final message is very true. We are talking about lack of resources, but implementation is the major problem. And that becomes again to issues of transparency, because even if you are tendering a project, there is so many issues that get raised about bypassing proper tender procedures that these projects get implemented. My recommendation would be to strengthen the oversight of whether it is the parliamentary audit processes of public spending. That is absolutely critical, because with limited resources, South Asia can do much more than it is doing at present.
Very clear, Dr. Dushni. More on strengthening oversight and transparency aspect rather than just spending. Spending is needed, however, but that's not the complete picture. What do you say, Dr. Fahmida? What is your key message? I think you're mute. Kindly unmute.
Okay.
Please.
Yes, my key point would be is that the government in South Asia and in general must take bold policy actions at this point in time. This is not a time to think of other, issues. For example, as it has been highlighted, I want to highlight again that this is not a time to think about the deficit, current account deficit or debt or all this. So bold policy actions with the participation of the stakeholders, the private sector, the civil society, and the community at large. Thank you.
Perfect. Very clear. I hope it gets the headline in the newspaper tomorrow. Thank you. Okay, we got a bit lucky because we got two, unfortunately, our colleagues could not join us because of technical reasons, but we managed to get a little more interactive discussion going to the extent possible in these virtual kind of things. It's quite new to me to try and engage people, but I'm very profoundly thankful to the panelists for allowing me to sort of interrupt and ask questions again and again. And we try and make it a little more interactive although we are all staring at our screens at the moment. Such is the reality of this world. I think it's fairly clear, especially with one last minute messages, but in my job as moderator, Sajid will kill me if I don't do that. He said, you have to summarize it in the end. So let me try and have a 1 minute, 2 minute snapshot of the whole discussion, the context setting. So I think there is clear messaging coming out in terms of, number one, but it is alluded directly or indirectly very clearly, the need of the hour is focus on public investments, which addresses poverty, all sorts of other development concerns, green recovery, and so on and so forth. Fiscal space should be created and should be used effectively, and we should go all out, not worry about deficits and all those kind of indicators, typical indicators at this point in time. That was a very clear message in terms of the role of the government. They should go all out now. That's a very fundamental message. So don't think about austerity as I put it in a nutshell. That's one. Now, while we were talking about that, there was questions raised on the floor as well, and we interacted that to be able to do that, and Dushni actually in particular highlighted that, you cannot just have resources and go after investing in people and assume things going to be delivered. You need a very efficient, capable bureaucracy, essentially, to implement the priorities, which would emerge after a consultative process, as Dr. Fahmida was saying towards the end, and a participatory kind of dialogue. So euphemistically, we typically call it effective fiscal governance, which has several elements. The transparency has to be there. The accountability has to be there. Abid alluded the importance of continuation of professional expertise should be assured, so the continuation of policies actually in turn can be delivered. And those aspects cannot be ignored while we highlight the need for further public investments or continuation of public investments. So these two things in a way need to go side by side. If I put it slightly differently, I think it's a great opportunity for the governments to demonstrate what they are capable of, rather than on the back foot and taking this kind of thing, oh, look, you guys cannot deliver development, and hence you have to pursue austerity and balance your budgets and not accumulate debt and so on and so forth, because you haven't done much for the population. This is an opportunity to demonstrate, because for once the entire global community, including traditional, very cautious institutions like IMF and World Bank, are also in favor of more fiscal spending or fiscal aid at this point in time. The momentum is in the favor. It will be a shame if the government actually lose this opportunity, but they have to demonstrate they align their spending with the needs of people. You cannot just build more missiles and more roads, which leads to nowhere. Invest in people. Go after investing in health systems. Go after delivering more effective social protection system, because that has been exposed. Try and mitigate inequalities. Bring in elements of green economic recovery. Focus on climate change issues, right? And the indicators will show up. I couldn't ask this question directly, but one panelist also highlighted what are the indicators we should look at, then we can say, oh, we have now recovered from COVID-19. Well, there's a series of indicators that will tell you how it can be delivered. While they are doing that and taking advantages of this opportunity, I think other fundamental message that has emerged from this conversation is focus on the capacity of the government. And we talked about multiple aspects. One, importance of effective coordination between different policy arms and units and ministries. Without that, governments are not going to go far. You're going to continue to have this isolation kind of policies. And we discussed some very specific examples how you can do that. Other theme that kept coming back again and again was the transparency and accountability, those in charge of delivering those things. As Dr. Dushni said, the institutional capacity has to be strengthened. The oversight ability on who's spending has to be strengthened quite a bit as well. So upshot is very, very simple for governments of tomorrow. And there are a couple of other themes that I wanted to pick, especially in the context of innovation and technology. I thought Dr. Chaturvedi will actually highlight those things. But we were trying to go after, this is 21st century. Bureaucrats has to be very up to the speed, basically, in terms of the needs of the hour, right? So they cannot have arcane processes dictating a generation that is grown up on social media, that is extremely comfortable with technology. They expect technology to deliver solutions for them because that's what they do on a daily basis, right? So message is very simple. Governments should play a very proactive role in steering the economy and giving a very clear direction through effective communication, as Abid very succinctly put it. And at the same time, reforms, I don't like the word that much, but reforms should be pursued continue to be pursued, where the effectiveness of governance and bureaucracy remains the focus. While you give green light to bureaucrats to spend more, you sort of keep a stick and say, you are accountable to the public at the end of the day, so please deliver on their priorities. And we are going to ask you in a qualitative sense, as Abid was saying, on your performance measures rather than just counting the beans. So I profusely once again thank you all participants for very interactive discussion. It's a big topic. We can continue the conversation on multiple angles. And I think after our first round, it narrowed in more on the coordination and transparency aspect, which is perfectly all right. I hope our participants benefited a little bit, get some clarity, some messages clear. And these kind of conversations, I think, are a continuation of the process. And I thank SDPI in particularly to organizing this session, for giving me or UNESCAP the opportunity to be part of this conversation. We, and I believe myself very strongly now, in favor of a very effective role of public sector investments in delivering development of our societies and economies. With these remarks, I thank you all and hand over back to Sajid for any final housekeeping observations.